Picture a shadowy infirmary in the 1400s, where the air hums with whispered prayers and the sharp scent of herbs. A healer bends over a patient, their hands steady despite the fear gripping their heart, because in this era, saving lives could mean losing your own. This was the reality for countless forgotten pioneers of medieval medicine, men and women who stood at the crossroads of superstition and science, armed with nothing but courage and curiosity. Their names may have faded from history, but their breakthroughs echo through every modern hospital, every life-saving treatment we take for granted today. Why does their story matter now? Because medicine wasn't built in gleaming laboratories or sterile clinics. It was forged in the dim light of plague-stricken villages, behind monastery walls where scholars copied forbidden texts, and on battlefields where surgeons improvised tools from farm implements. These healers didn't just battle disease, they fought ignorance, prejudice, and even accusations of witchcraft. Some paid with their freedom, others with their lives. Yet without their stubborn refusal to accept the limits of their time, we might still be bleeding patients to balance their humors or blaming illnesses on angry spirits. So who were these extraordinary figures? Over the next half hour, we'll meet 30 of history's most overlooked medical rebels, from the Arab physician who mapped the circulatory system centuries before Western science caught up, to the midwives whose herbal remedies were dismissed as women's magic until they proved more effective than the barber surgeon's knife. You'll discover how a Persian polymath invented quarantine during the Black Death, why a French nun's hospital reforms scandalized the church, and what drove a German alchemist to risk execution by dissecting corpses in secret. Their legacy isn't just about scalpels and potions, it's a testament to human resilience. So settle in, because this isn't just a history lesson. It's a chance to walk alongside the bravest healers you've never heard of until now. Imagine a world where a fever could be blamed on demonic possession, where a broken bone might be treated with incantations instead of splints, and where the line between healer and heretic was dangerously thin. This was the reality of medicine in the so-called Dark Ages, a time when the knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen had been lost or distorted, buried under layers of fear and religious dogma. Monasteries became the unlikely guardians of medical texts, preserving fragments of wisdom in handwritten manuscripts, while outside their walls, most people relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. The average physician of this era might prescribe a poultice of crushed earthworms for a headache, or advise drinking powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, to ward off poisoning. Surgery was often performed by barbers, whose razors doubled as amputation tools, and anesthesia was little more than a strong drink or a knock to the head. Yet even in this climate of confusion, glimmers of progress flickered. Arab scholars in places like Baghdad and Cordoba were advancing anatomy and pharmacology, while in Europe, a handful of daring individuals began questioning old superstitions. What made their work so radical? They dared to observe the human body directly, rather than relying solely on ancient texts. A midwife might notice that washing her hands before delivering a baby reduced infections, even if she didn't understand germ theory. An apothecary could experiment with herbal mixtures, quietly documenting which ones eased pain without causing delirium. These small acts of defiance laid the groundwork for a medical revolution, one that would eventually push humanity out of the shadows and into the light of modern science. But for every healer who made a breakthrough, there were a dozen more whose names we'll never know, silenced by plague, persecution, or simply the passage of time. Their courage, though, is written in the pages of history, if you know where to look. In the bustling port city of Salerno during the 11th century, where Mediterranean traders exchanged spices and scholars debated Aristotle, one woman quietly reshaped the future of medicine. Trota wasn't just a healer, she was a revolutionary in an era when women weren't even allowed to attend universities. While most female knowledge of the body was dismissed as folk wisdom, she documented her treatments with the precision of a scholar, compiling her insights into a groundbreaking text called On the Sufferings of Women. Picture the audacity this required. A woman prescribing remedies for childbirth pain, infections, and even infertility, at a time when male physicians believed the womb could wander through the body like a restless animal. Her approach was radical not just for its content but for its humanity. Where others saw weakness in female patients, Trota saw strength. She insisted on cleanliness long before germ theory existed, advising midwives to wash their hands and tools with vinegar. She rejected the brutal practices of her male counterparts, who often treated women's ailments with bleeding or cauterization, instead offering herbal baths and gentle massages. But perhaps most astonishing was her belief that women deserved to understand their own bodies, an idea so threatening that later scribes tried to erase her entirely, rebranding her work under the fictional name Trota to make it palatable for a male-dominated profession. Yet Trota's voice couldn't be silenced. Her words survived in the margins of manuscripts copied by nuns in secluded convents and carried across Europe by traveling midwives. When a village woman soothed a new mother with a remedy of chamomile and honey, when a wise woman prevented infection by boiling linen bandages, these were echoes of Trota's wisdom, passed down like a secret through generations. It would take 800 years for medicine to officially rediscover what she knew all along. That compassion is as vital as any scalpel, and that healing begins by listening to those the world too often ignores. Her legacy whispers to us still, in every hospital where a female doctor's expertise is unquestioned, in every clinic where dignity is part of the treatment plan. Trota didn't just heal bodies, she healed history itself. While Trota's legacy simmered in southern Italy, another revolutionary voice emerged in the misty forests of medieval Germany, one that saw divinity in every leaf and healing in every hymn. Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess, didn't just treat disease, she wove medicine into a tapestry of faith, nature, and cosmic harmony. Imagine a woman so revered for her visions that popes and emperors sought her counsel, yet so grounded in earthly wisdom that she could prescribe willow bark tea for inflammation centuries before scientists isolated its active ingredient, aspirin. Her secret, seeing the human body not as a battleground of humors or demons, but as a garden where physical and spiritual health grew intertwined. Her Encyclopedia Physica reads like a love letter to creation, cataloging over 2,000 remedies from the common yarrow to the exotic amber. Where other healers saw simple ingredients to boil or grind, Hildegard saw sacred conversations. She wrote of sapphires curing blindness not through magic, but by their cooling properties that soothed swollen eyes. She paired feverfew with prayers, not because the prayers themselves lowered fevers, but because calming the mind helped the body heal. This wasn't just medicine, it was an early blueprint for what we now call holistic care. Yet history nearly erased her brilliance. While her mystical writings were copied and cherished, Physica gathered dust in monastery libraries. Why? Because a woman reconciling faith and science threatened the very hierarchies that granted her limited authority. Church scholars praised her visions but dismissed her medicine as women's law. Male physicians, eager to professionalize their field, sidelined her remedies as quaint superstitions, even as they unknowingly prescribed her discoveries. It took 800 years for modern researchers to confirm what Hildegard knew all along: that lavender eases migraines, that fennel aids digestion, and that true healing requires tending both flesh and spirit. Her greatest rebellion wasn't in her prescriptions, but in her insistence that healing belonged to everyone. While universities barred women from medical study, she taught peasants to recognize healing plants by their leaves and scent. While theologians debated whether the sick deserved compassion, she turned her convent into a sanctuary where lepers were washed with rosewater instead of shunned. Today, as science rediscovers the gut-brain connection and the placebo effect's power, Hildegard's vision feels less like medieval mysticism and more like medicine catching up with wisdom it forgot. Her legacy lingers in every doctor who listens as intently as they prescribe, in every garden where basil grows not just for flavor, but for its power to lift both mood and metabolism. In the candlelit scriptoriums of 10th century Cordoba, where scholars pored over Greek philosophy and the call to prayer echoed through orange-scented courtyards, one man was quietly rewriting the rules of medicine with steel. Al-Bucossis, born Abul Qasim Khalaf ibn Abbas al-Zahrawi, wasn't just a physician. He was a master craftsman who turned the crude tools of medieval surgery into instruments of astonishing precision. Picture a world where amputations were performed with butcher's knives, where wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons. Then imagine this soft-spoken scholar sketching designs for over 200 specialized tools, each one tailored to a specific purpose. His magnum opus, Al-Tasrif, wasn't just a medical text. It was an illustrated revolution, showing how to remove bladder stones with scoops curved like crescent moons, how to suture with catgut threads, even how to extract teeth with pliers designed to minimize shattering the jaw. What set Al-Bucossis apart wasn't just his ingenuity. It was his unshakable belief that surgery should cause as little harm as possible. While European barber surgeons sawed through bone with little regard for pain or infection, he insisted on sterilizing tools in boiling water, a practice dismissed as unnecessary until 7 centuries later. He pioneered the use of silk for stitching wounds, invented the first syringe to clear ear blockages, and even described the use of anesthesia-soaked sponges to dull pain. Yet his most radical idea was something we now take for granted: detailed surgical diagrams. Before Al-Bucossis, most medical texts relied on vague descriptions. His painstaking illustrations showing exactly how to hold a scalpel or angle a bone drill transformed surgery from guesswork into a teachable science. So why does his name linger in obscurity while figures like Hippocrates dominate medical history? Part of the answer lies in the slow erosion of cultural memory. As Al-Tasrif traveled translated into Latin, Hebrew, and eventually French, his identity blurred. European surgeons eagerly adopted his tools but often scrubbed his name from the texts, attributing his breakthroughs to vague Arab masters or even claiming the ideas as their own. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought back his techniques without understanding their origin. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, the very instruments that had made modern surgery possible were wielded by hands that had forgotten the man who forged them. Yet traces of Al-Bucossis' genius persist in every operating room today. That gleaming tray of sterilized scalpels, his insistence on cleanliness laid its foundation. The delicate forceps a surgeon uses to clamp a bleeding vessel, a direct descendant of his designs. Even the concept of surgical specialization, different tools for different procedures, stems from his belief that medicine should adapt to the body's needs, not the other way around. His legacy is a reminder that progress isn't just about discovery. but about the humility to learn from minds the world too often overlooks. In the end, Al-Bucossis didn't just invent instruments, he crafted the very idea that healing could be both an art and a precision science. In the 11th century, as Europe languished in medical darkness, a Tunisian monk with a genius for languages embarked on a mission that would change history, one handwritten page at a time. Constantine the African wasn't a physician in the traditional sense, but his quill proved mightier than any scalpel. Born in Carthage, he spent decades traversing the Mediterranean, collecting medical texts from Baghdad's glittering libraries and Cairo's bustling apothecaries, smuggling them past suspicious customs officials in hollowed-out loaves of bread or rolled inside prayer rugs. His greatest treasure, the lost works of Hippocrates and Galen, preserved and expanded upon by Arab scholars while Europe had forgotten them. When Constantine arrived at the Abbey of Monte Cassino in Italy, he brought more than parchment. He carried the seeds of a revolution. By candlelight, hunched over vellum, he translated over 37 texts from Arabic and Greek into Latin, the language of European scholars. Imagine the shock of monks reading his Pantagni, which described the pulse as a diagnostic tool, or his translations detailing how diet could prevent disease. These weren't just words, they were keys to unlocking a medical tradition Europe had thought vanished forever. Yet every page came at a price. Church authorities, wary of foreign ideas, accused Constantine of importing pagan knowledge. Rival scholars dismissed his work as derivative, though they eagerly copied his translations. Even his allies whispered that a man who moved so freely between Islam and Christianity must have made dangerous compromises. When he died in exile, his grave bore no mention of his medical legacy, only a vague epitaph calling him a man of many travels. Why does history overlook him? Because translators rarely get the glory of pioneers, though without them, progress stalls. Constantine's story mirrors the plight of countless knowledge bearers, essential yet invisible, their labor credited to others. Today, as researchers digitize ancient texts or translate cutting-edge studies, they walk in his footsteps, bridging worlds so that healing knows no borders. His true monument isn't in stone, but in every library where wisdom outlasts its keepers, and in every doctor who unknowingly quotes Hippocrates through the Latin words Constantine, saved from oblivion. On the blood-soaked battlefields of 14th century England, where arrows rained down and swords shattered bone, one man moved calmly through the carnage, not as a soldier but as a healer. John of Arden wasn't just a surgeon. He was a battlefield innovator who transformed medieval medicine with a combination of steady hands, keen observation, and a willingness to challenge centuries of medical dogma. Picture a man stitching torn flesh with silk thread while knights screamed around him, or mixing a paste of opium and henbane to dull the agony of amputations, a primitive anesthetic long before the discovery of ether. His greatest weapon wasn't a scalpel but a quill, the detailed manuals he penned, filled with illustrations so precise they could still guide a surgeon today. What set John apart was his refusal to accept the fatalism of his era. While many physicians believed wounds festered because of bad air or divine punishment, he noticed patterns, that cleaning a wound with wine reduced swelling, that tightly bandaged gashes healed faster than those left exposed. His most famous innovation, a treatment for pilonidal cysts, a common affliction among knights who spent hours on horseback. His technique, draining the abscess with a carefully placed incision, then packing it with lint soaked in egg white and rose oil, was so effective it remained standard practice for 600 years. Yet his brilliance nearly vanished into the smoke of history. As the Black Death swept Europe, wiping out a third of the population, medical knowledge was among its casualties. Monasteries burned, libraries collapsed, and entire towns emptied. John's manuscripts should have been lost, but they survived because of an unlikely ally, the very warriors he'd spent his life patching up. Knights returning from the 100 Years' War carried his folded, blood-stained pages in their saddlebags, passing them like sacred relics to field surgeons across France and England. The irony, John himself was no saint. He charged wealthy nobles exorbitant fees, sometimes an entire year's wages for a single procedure, while treating poor soldiers for free. This duality captures the complexity of medieval medicine, a blend of compassion and commerce, where life-saving knowledge often depended on the whims of patronage. Today, as surgeons study his meticulous diagrams of hernias and hemorrhoids, they're not just looking at historical curiosities, they're seeing the roots of modern surgical technique. John's legacy lives on in every sterile operating room, every suture kit, and every medical student who learns that the difference between healing and harm often lies in the details. Jacoba Felice stood in a Paris courtroom in the year 1322, surrounded by scowling magistrates and jeering male physicians, her hands still stained with the herbs she'd used to treat a feverish child that morning. The charge, practicing medicine without a license, a crime only because she was a woman. Imagine the scene, noble women bursting into tears as they testified to her life-saving skills, while university-trained doctors dismissed her as a presumptuous herb wife. Here was a healer who delivered babies safely when male physicians refused to touch laboring women, who'd cured infections with honey poultices while others bled patients weak. Yet the court's verdict was inevitable, a crushing fine, a ban from ever treating the sick again, and a warning that her next offense would land her in prison. What makes Jacoba's story so extraordinary isn't just her defiance, it's the paper trail she left behind. Unlike most medieval women healers erased by time, her trial record survived. We know she argued passionately that experience mattered more than diplomas, citing cases where she'd succeeded where licensed doctors failed. She reminded the court that women patients often preferred her care, as male physicians wouldn't even examine them properly, diagnosing everything through urine samples while refusing to touch their bodies. Her most damning point, that the real crime wasn't her practice, it was letting pride and prejudice override healing, yet history swallowed her whole. While male surgeons of her era are remembered as pioneers, Jacoba vanished into footnotes. Why? Because her trial wasn't really about medicine, it was about power. The University of Paris, newly granted a monopoly on medical licensing, saw unlicensed healers as threats to their authority. Women like Jacoba, with their practical knowledge and loyal patients, undermined the emerging hierarchy that equated credentials with competence. Silencing her set a precedent. For centuries after, women would be barred from medical schools, forced to practice in shadows or risk accusations of witchcraft. But Jacoba's legacy refused to die. In secret, midwives still passed down her remedies. Apothecary wives kept her herbal blends alive under the guise of kitchen physic. And when the plague came, even the proudest physicians had to admit that the so-called ignorant women saving lives in the gutters knew more than they did. Today, as we debate who gets to call themselves a healer, licensed professionals versus traditional practitioners, Jacoba's ghost whispers a timeless truth. Medicine belongs to whoever can ease suffering, whether their diploma hangs on velvet or their knowledge lies in their hands. Her real victory wasn't in that courtroom, but in every woman who's ever stitched a wound, soothed a fever, or stood her ground when the world said she didn't belong. Henry de Monville paced the halls of the Royal College of Surgeons in Paris, his hands still raw from scrubbing with vinegar and rosewater after that morning's amputation. It was the early 1300s, and the air reeked of blood and unwashed wool, but Henry carried a different scent, the sharp, clean tang of wine-soaked bandages. While his peers boasted about the laudable pus that supposedly signaled healing, this stubborn French surgeon kept meticulous records proving the opposite. Patients whose wounds he cleaned daily with alcohol-infused dressings survived at twice the rate of those left to fester. Yet when he presented his findings, the room erupted in laughter. One colleague sneered that his obsession with cleanliness was womanly, while another accused him of wasting good wine. What made Henry's approach so radical wasn't just his methods, it was his understanding of cause and effect. Long before microscopes revealed bacteria, he theorized that invisible corruptions spread infection. He boiled his instruments, insisted surgeons trim their fingernails and wash their hands, even designed an early surgical apron to keep blood and debris off clothing. His treatise Chirurgia reads like a manifesto. The surgeon's first duty is to avoid harming with filth what he means to heal with skill. But the medical establishment dismissed him as a fanatic. When the Black Death struck, their reliance on amulets and bloodletting proved useless, yet still, they clung to tradition. The tragedy, Henry's wisdom wasn't lost, it was actively suppressed. After his death, scribes copying Chirurgia deliberately omitted his cleanliness protocols, considering them unnecessary additions. Wealthy patrons preferred dramatic procedures over mundane hygiene, so surgeons eager for patronage focused on showy techniques. By the time germ theory emerged in the 1800s, Henry's name had faded into obscurity until Joseph Lister stumbled upon a moldering copy of Chirurgia in a monastery library. The British surgeon would credit those wine-stained pages as the spark for his own antiseptic revolution, finally proving what Henry had known all along, that saving lives often begins with something as simple as soap and water. Henry's legacy whispers in every scrub sink, every autoclave, every gloved hand in an operating room today. He reminds us that progress isn't just about new discoveries. Sometimes it's about having the courage to defend obvious truths against the weight of ignorance. In an age where surgeons took pride in their blood-crusted frock coats, this forgotten pioneer dared to suggest that medicine's future might smell less like a battlefield and more like a vineyard after rain. In the dimly lit chambers of the University of Siena, where parchment crackled under the weight of half-truths and superstition, a young Portuguese scholar named Petrus Hispanus scribbled notes that would upend medieval medicine. Long before he donned the papal tiara, this son of a physician was quietly assembling a masterpiece, the Thesaurus Pauperum, or Treasure of the Poor. Unlike the dense Latin texts reserved for elite scholars, Petrus wrote in clear, practical language, offering remedies even the humblest village healer could understand. Imagine a future pope prescribing garlic for toothaches, or explaining how to set broken bones with splints made from broom handles. His work wasn't just revolutionary, it was radically democratic, putting life-saving knowledge into hands the medical establishment had long ignored. What set Petrus apart wasn't just his medical brilliance, it was his willingness to challenge the sacred cows of his era. While most physicians still swore by Galen's theory of bodily humors, Petrus insisted on observing patients firsthand. He documented how fevers behaved differently in children versus adults, noted that certain herbs could ease pain without inducing delirium, and even suggested that some illnesses might spread through invisible seeds, a startling foreshadowing of germ theory 7 centuries early. His most enduring contribution, a detailed guide to compounding medicines where he emphasized precise measurements over guesswork. For the first time, an apothecary in London and a healer in Lisbon could prepare the same remedy with consistent results. Yet history remembers him primarily as Pope John the 21st, the only physician to ever lead the Catholic Church. How did a man of science ascend to such spiritual heights? The answer lies in the medieval mind's fluidity between faith and reason. Petrus saw no contradiction between dissecting cadavers and kneeling in prayer. To him, the human body was divine artistry begging to be understood. His medical fame likely smoothed his path through church ranks when cardinals fell ill, who better to treat them than Europe's most renowned doctor. But his papacy proved tragically brief. After just 8 months, a collapsing ceiling in his palace study crushed him ironically. The same curiosity that drove him to write about architecture's principles may have contributed to his death. The real tragedy, though, is how his medical legacy faded beneath papal robes. Universities continued teaching from Thesaurus Pauperum for 300 years, yet many students never realized its author wore the tiara. Copyists scrubbed his name from manuscripts, attributing his work to anonymous wise men. Even today, historians debate whether his papal role distracted him from medicine, or whether his deep understanding of the body's fragility made him uniquely compassionate as Christ's vicar. Perhaps Petrus himself would chuckle at the dichotomy. In his writings, he often noted that the best healers were those who recognized their own mortality. His life and death were the ultimate testament to that truth. In the golden halls of 12th century Constantinople, where silk-clad nobles sipped wine from jeweled cups, one woman slipped away nightly, not to a secret lover, but to a squalid ward full of coughing lepers. Theodora wasn't just another Byzantine princess. She was a royal rebel who turned her back on palace intrigues to kneel beside the sick, wrapping their sores with linen dipped in honey and myrrh. Picture the scandal: an emperor's niece scrubbing floors in the hospital she founded, pressing coins into beggars' hands, even turning her seaside villa into a sanctuary for lepers people most nobles crossed the street to avoid. While her family waged wars and plotted coups, Theodora waged a quieter battle against the idea that disease was divine punishment and that the suffering deserved their fate. Her most radical act, challenging the Byzantine elite's deepest fear, contagion, both physical and social. In an empire obsessed with purity, where the sick were often exiled beyond city walls, Theodora insisted that healing the afflicted was a Christian duty. She didn't just fund hospitals, she redesigned them, insisting on separate wards for contagious patients, fresh airflow through arched windows, and clean water channels, innovations that predated modern infection control by 8 centuries. But her true genius lay in understanding stigma. When lepers whispered that priests refused them last rites, she trained monks to anoint them. When mothers abandoned deformed newborns, she turned her orphanage into a nursery staffed by wet nurses. So why did history nearly erase her? Because compassion can be dangerous. Theodora's charity exposed the hypocrisy of an empire that called itself Christ's kingdom while ignoring the poor. Worse, her hospitals became political hotspots, places where the discontented gathered, where a leper might whisper secrets to a nurse who'd once been a noble's daughter. When her cousin Emperor Manuel died, rivals systematically dismantled her legacy. Chroniclers downplayed her work, attributing her hospitals to male patrons. Mosaics depicting her feeding the sick were chiseled away, yet fragments survived in the diaries of Venetian merchants who marveled at the golden princess who smelled of vinegar and courage. Theodora's story echoes wherever power tries to sanitize history. Her crime wasn't just helping the poor, it was proving that empires crumble when they value crowns more than compassion. Today, as we debate healthcare access and pandemic responses, her ghost lingers in every hospital corridor, asking the question that terrified her rivals most: if not the privileged, then who will heal the broken? In the smoky scriptorium of 12th century Toledo, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars bent over parchment under the same flickering oil lamps, one man's obsession with a single book would reshape the destiny of Western medicine. Gerard of Cremona arrived in Spain searching for Ptolemy's Almagest, but when he stumbled upon Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, a 1,000-page Persian masterpiece written a century earlier, he abandoned astronomy for a far more dangerous pursuit. For the next 40 years, this Italian monk labored in near-total secrecy, translating Avicenna's Arabic into Latin word by painstaking word, knowing that smuggling such knowledge into Christendom could get him branded a heretic. What made the canon so revolutionary and so risky? Avicenna had synthesized Greek, Persian, and Indian medicine into a unified system that described tuberculosis as contagious, identified meningitis symptoms, and mapped the optic nerve's path, all while Europe still believed illness sprang from unbalanced humors or divine wrath. Gerard's translation smuggled in explosive ideas. That dissection could reveal bodily truths, that clinical trials mattered more than tradition, even that mental health had physical causes. Yet his greatest challenge wasn't linguistic, it was cultural. Arabic terms like pulse and retina had no Latin equivalents, forcing him to invent new words that still echo in medical jargon today. The cruel irony, though Gerard's translation became the standard text at every European university from Paris to Padua, his name vanished from history. Printers omitted his preface to avoid church scrutiny. Professors taught Avicenna's wisdom as if it had always existed in Latin. By the time the canon reached its peak influence, prescribed reading for every physician from the 1300s to the 1700s, Gerard had died destitute, buried in an unmarked grave. Even now, historians debate whether his anonymity was accidental or deliberate. A church wary of Islamic influence had every reason to erase the translator who'd smuggled so much foreign knowledge into the curriculum. Yet traces of Gerard's fingerprints remain. In the margins of surviving manuscripts, careful readers can spot his handwritten notes, questions about Arabic idioms, musings on tricky anatomical terms. These scribbles reveal a man who wasn't just a conduit for knowledge, but an active interpreter wrestling with Avicenna's ideas. When he rendered the Arabic al-Jaziyat as capillaries, or coined the term sciatica from an Arabic description of hip pain, he wasn't just translating, he was building a bridge between worlds. Today, as medical students still learn from texts that crossed languages and cultures, Gerard's ghost whispers a timeless lesson. Progress depends not just on genius, but on the unsung hands that carry wisdom across the divides of fear and prejudice. His legacy lives on in every Latin term we use without thinking, in every borrowed idea that healed because someone dared to translate it. Bologna, 1314. The air in the university's candlelit anatomy theater hung thick with incense, not for ceremony, but to mask the stench of decay. At the center stood Mondino de Luzzi, a man whose scalpel was about to slash through centuries of superstition. While most medieval physicians relied on diagrams copied from ancient texts, Mondino demanded something radical: actual human bodies. Night after night, under the flickering light of torches, he peeled back skin and muscle before crowds of wide-eyed students, mapping organs with a precision Europe hadn't seen since Roman surgeons were banned from dissection 700 years earlier. His audacity birthed the first modern anatomy textbook, Anatomia Corporis Humani, a work so detailed it remained mandatory reading for doctors well into the 1600s. But Mondino's brilliance came at a price. The Church had long decreed that cutting open corpses violated the sanctity of the human form, God's sacred vessel. Even as medical students flocked to his lectures, priests denounced him from pulpits, accusing him of trafficking with the dead. Public dissections were technically legal, but only if performed on executed criminals, and only with the understanding that the body would be reassembled for Christian burial. Mondino stretched these rules to their limits. He dissected pregnant women to study fetal development, examined brains to trace nerve pathways, even preserved organs in vinegar to study them over time. Each incision felt like heresy to those who believed the soul's seat was in the liver, or that the womb could wander through the body like a lost bird. The tension between faith and science simmered in every stroke of his knife. When Mondino demonstrated that the heart had 4 chambers, not 3 as Galen claimed, theologians recoiled. If ancient wisdom could be wrong about anatomy, what else might be flawed? His sketches of the digestive system, showing how food truly traveled from stomach to intestine, undermined folk remedies like hunger stones meant to suppress appetite. Yet Mondino navigated these dangers with shrewd diplomacy. He framed his work as uncovering God's craftsmanship, insisting that studying the body deepened reverence for its divine maker. By the time he died, even some clergy quietly admitted his findings had saved lives, like his discovery that a punctured lung could collapse, explaining why chest wounds often proved fatal. History remembers Mondino as the father of modern anatomy, but his true legacy is subtler. In a world where truth was dictated by authority, he taught students to trust their eyes over ancient texts. Those who watched him lift a human heart from a cadaver didn't just learn biology, they learned that progress requires the courage to question, even when the answers unsettle heaven itself. Today, as surgeons transplant organs and map DNA, they walk a path Mondino carved with a steady hand and an unflinching gaze into the body's forbidden depths. His story whispers a timeless lesson. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is daring to see what others declare invisible. Christine de Pizan dipped her quill into ink, her hand hovering over the parchment as she weighed each word with the precision of a surgeon. In the candlelit chambers of 15th century Paris, where male physicians debated women's ailments without ever consulting a woman, this widow-turned scholar dared to do the unthinkable, write about female health from lived experience. While history remembers her fiery defenses of women's intellect in the Book of the City of Ladies, her lesser-known The Treasury of the Queen contained something even more subversive: medical advice that rejected the brutal norms of her time. Imagine the audacity, a woman with no formal training contradicting university-educated doctors, insisting that excessive bloodletting weakened rather than healed, that childbirth required patience and cleanliness rather than superstition and haste. Her approach was revolutionary because it centered women's voices. Where male texts described the female body as a flawed version of the male, prone to hysteria and wandering wombs, Christine gathered wisdom from midwives, mothers, and even her own bouts of illness. She prescribed cooling baths for feverish pregnancies when others reached for lancets, advocated herbal teas over purgatives for menstrual pain, and most radical of all, suggested that women's accounts of their symptoms should be believed. The body knows its suffering, she wrote, a concept so alien to medieval medicine that scribes copying her work often corrected it to align with Galen's theories. Yet Christine's dual legacy, feminist icon and medical heretic, fractured under the weight of institutional bias. Universities canonized her literary works while quietly burying her health writings. Male translators sanitized her texts, attributing her remedies to anonymous wise women, or folding them into male-authored compendiums without credit. By the time the printing press arrived, the treasury had been gutted, its most progressive passages scrubbed away as domestic advice unfit for scholarly attention. The irony, while her feminist tracts were celebrated in elite circles, the very women who needed her medical insights, peasants bleeding out after childbirth, merchants' wives dosed with mercury never knew her name. The suppression of Christine's healing wisdom reveals a darker truth. Medieval society feared knowledgeable women far more than ignorant ones. A poetess praising female virtue was tolerable. A woman explaining how to stanch postpartum hemorrhage threatened the entire medical hierarchy. Today, as historians piece together her lost remedies from marginalia and household manuscripts, they uncover a pattern. Her advice worked. The rosemary-infused wine she recommended for fatigue. Rich in antioxidants, her warning against tight, lacing gowns during pregnancy, centuries ahead of its time. Christine's real crime wasn't inaccuracy, it was proving that sometimes the best medicine comes not from ancient scrolls, but from listening to those who have endured the pain. Guy de Chauliac woke to the sound of church bells tolling endlessly, not for prayer, but for the dead. It was the year 1348 in Avignon, and the Black Death had turned the papal city into a charnel house. As personal physician to 3 popes, Guy could have barricaded himself behind palace walls with sacks of aromatic herbs and prayers for protection. Instead, this French surgeon did something unprecedented. He walked straight into the pestilence with ink-stained fingers and a determination to record every fevered gasp, every swollen bubo, every desperate remedy tried in the dying light. While others saw only God's wrath, Guy saw patterns, clues that would one day crack the code of history's deadliest pandemic. His Chirurgia Magna reads like a war correspondent's dispatch from the front lines of hell. With clinical precision, he documented how the plague progressed from the first headache to the final bloody cough, noting which victims survived longest and why. He debunked popular cures like rubbing onions on sores or drinking powdered emeralds, proving they did nothing but empty purses, most radical of all. His insistence that the disease spread through corrupted air and close contact centuries before germ theory. When terrified towns burned Jewish communities alive, blaming them for poisoning wells, Guy risked excommunication by publicly declaring the accusations nonsense, a stance that put him at odds with the very church he served. Yet for all his bravery, history nearly swallowed Guy whole. The tragedy wasn't just the millions who died, it was how the trauma of the plague blurred the memories of those who fought it. Survivors wanted to forget the stench, the piles of bodies, the way entire villages vanished overnight. In that collective amnesia, Guy's meticulous notes gathered dust in monastery libraries, overshadowed by more sensational accounts of divine punishment. Even his groundbreaking observation that the plague came in 2 forms, bubonic and pneumonic, wasn't fully appreciated until modern epidemiologists rediscovered his work. What makes his obscurity so poignant is the sheer humanity in his writings. Between descriptions of blackened lymph nodes, he paused to record small acts of courage. A nun who held dying strangers' hands until her own fingers stiffened. A baker who kept feeding orphans even as his shop became a morgue. Unlike the aloof scholars of his era, Guy admitted his own fear, confessing he'd fallen ill and survived only through luck, or as he put it, God's reluctant mercy. Perhaps that vulnerability doomed his legacy in an age that preferred heroes unsullied by doubt. Today, as epidemiologists trace COVID variants or Ebola outbreaks, they echo Guy's method: observe, document, learn. His ghost lingers in every field hospital, every disease diary, reminding us that the greatest weapon against pandemics isn't just science but the courage to bear witness when the world is ending. Beneath the flickering oil lamps of 10th century Cordoba, a man bent over a workbench, filing the edges of a delicate metal tool that would change the course of medical history. Al-Bucossis, already renowned for his surgical innovations, turned his attention to one of humanity's most universal agonies, toothache, in an era when dentists were often blacksmiths wielding pliers and cavities were blamed on toothworms or moral failings. this polymath approached dental pain with something revolutionary precision. His designs for specialized forceps, scalers, and even early drills weren't just crude instruments. They were masterpieces of ergonomic engineering, shaped to fit the curve of molars or grip stubborn roots without shattering the jaw. His illustrated manual Al-Tasrif devoted an entire chapter to dentistry, detailing how to drain abscesses with hollow needles, stabilize loose teeth with gold wire, and fill cavities with a mixture of resin and mastic, a primitive filling centuries before the West embraced such techniques. What set Al-Bucossis apart wasn't just his technical brilliance, it was his empathy. He rejected the prevailing belief that tooth extraction should be a brutal spectacle, often performed at fairs as entertainment. Instead, he advocated for privacy, cleanliness, and even early forms of anesthesia, soaking sponges in opium and henbane to dull the pain, his most poignant innovation. A set of false teeth carved from animal bone, designed for patients who'd suffered humiliation from tooth loss. "The mouth is the gateway to dignity," he wrote, a sentiment unheard of in an age that viewed dental ailments as divine punishment. Yet history's memory is fickle. As Al-Tasrif traveled across Europe in translation, scribes gradually scrubbed away Al-Bucossis' identity. His dental tools appeared in Renaissance etchings labeled as ancient Roman inventions, though the Romans had used nothing more sophisticated than pliers. French surgeons claimed credit for his techniques, while Italian barbers displayed his forceps as family heirlooms, forgetting their origin. The erasure wasn't accidental, it reflected a deeper bias. Medieval Europe, grappling with cultural tensions after the Crusades, was eager to distance itself from Moorish knowledge, even as it relied on it. The irony, Al-Bucossis' dental innovations quietly shaped practices still used today. That curved elevator tool your dentist uses to loosen teeth, a direct descendant of his design. The concept of sterilizing instruments before oral surgery, he insisted on boiling them in vinegar. Even his warnings against extracting teeth at the first sign of pain, urging healers to attempt fillings or drainage first, predated modern conservative dentistry by nearly a millennium. His ghost lingers in every dental school where students learn that the difference between healing and harm often lies in the grace of a well-shaped tool and the courage to remember the hands that forged it. While Hildegard of Bingen's legacy glows bright in history's spotlight, the dim corridors of medieval convents hide a quieter revolution, the tireless work of nameless nuns who turned cloisters into Europe's first true hospitals. Picture a typical infirmary in the 1200s, stone floors scrubbed with vinegar, linen bandages drying near herb gardens, and a sister bending over a feverish patient, humming psalms as she grinds willow bark into pain-relieving powder. These women had no medical degrees, no published treatises, yet their daily acts of compassion, washing sores, brewing antiseptic sage tea, holding the hands of the dying, laid the very bedrock of modern nursing. What made their approach so radical? Unlike male physicians who saw patients as puzzles to solve, the sisters practiced what we'd now call holistic care. A nun treating a consumptive child might prescribe honeyed thyme syrup for the cough, yes, but she'd also ensure the child slept near a window for fresh air, wrapped them in a blanket woven by the convent's weavers, and assigned another orphan to sit with them so they wouldn't fear the dark. Their infirmary records, often scribbled in margins of prayer books, reveal astonishing pragmatism, noting that patients fed on broth with garlic recovered faster, that lavender oil soothed burns better than lard, even that separating those with the shaking fever from others slowed its spread. Yet their anonymity wasn't accidental. Church chroniclers praised their obedience and piety, but rarely their medical skill. When a noblewoman recovered under their care, credit went to divine intervention, not the sisters who'd boiled clean bandages or measured doses of poppy milk for pain. Male physicians dismissed their remedies as kitchen physic, even as they quietly adopted their techniques. The cruelest irony, many convent infirmaries were later shuttered during the Protestant Reformation, their records burned as popish superstition, erasing centuries of accumulated wisdom. But traces remain. In a faded ledger from a Belgian abbey, one line hints at their legacy. Sister Johanna, buried today, 32 summers, never turned a beggar from our door. No statues bear her name, no medical texts cite her cures, just this quiet epitaph for a woman who spent her life closing wounds both visible and unseen. Her true monument, every nurse who still measures comfort alongside medicine, who knows that healing isn't just about the body, but the fragile human spirit within it. Arnold of Villanova stood barefoot in a sunlit courtyard near Barcelona, holding a feverish child toward the light like an offering. It was the late 1300s, and this physician alchemist was committing heresy with every sunbeam. While his peers prescribed bloodletting and prayers, Arnold had a different revelation, that nature itself held cures more potent than any leech or relic. His regimen for the sick read like a modern wellness guide: fresh air, moderate exercise, vegetables from monastery gardens, and above all, sunlight. To medieval minds steeped in humoral theory, this was madness. Disease came from imbalances within, they believed, not some invisible lack in the environment. Yet Arnold's patients thrived, especially those with the bone-wasting sickness we now recognize as rickets. His notes describe how children who could barely walk after winter months would stagger into his clinic, only to skip out by midsummer after daily doses of sunshine. What made his methods truly dangerous wasn't their simplicity, but their challenge to authority. As a respected professor at Montpellier's medical school, Arnold could have risen through the ranks by towing the Gaelic line. Instead, he openly mocked colleagues who prescribed gold potions to peasants, writing scathingly, "A starving man needs bread, not the philosopher's stone." His alchemical pursuits only deepened the suspicion when he distilled alcohol into medicinal tinctures or used sulfur to fumigate sick rooms. Inquisitors whispered of demonic pacts. The final straw came when he claimed melancholia could be eased by walks in daylight rather than exorcisms. Church officials who profited handsomely from selling indulgences to the mentally ill weren't about to let science undercut their business. The flames that consumed Arnold's manuscripts in 1305 didn't just destroy medical knowledge, they erased a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern science. Fragments salvaged by his students reveal startling insights: descriptions of scurvy's cure in citrus fruits, warnings against mercury-based cosmetics, even early observations about how window glass filtered sunlight's healing properties. His greatest loss, a treatise arguing that hospitals should face south to catch the sun, a design principle Florence Nightingale would rediscover 5 centuries later during the Crimean War. The bitter irony today, as we synthesize vitamin D in labs and prescribe light therapy for seasonal depression, we've come full circle to Arnold's vision. His real crime wasn't heresy, it was proving that sometimes the most powerful medicine doesn't come from a flask or a chant, but from the sky itself, free for all to share. In an age where the church sold salvation by the vial, that truth was more dangerous than any alchemical fire. The crimson-striped pole outside a shop wasn't just a sign, it was a warning. Step inside a medieval barber-surgeon's workshop, and the air would hit you first. Iron scented from the bloodletting bowl, herbs sharp from the poultices, and underneath it all, the sour tang of fear. These men, part shave masters, part bone sowers, stood where medicine's rubber met the road. Need a tooth yanked, a gangrenous limb lopped off, a boil lanced. The barber surgeon was your only hope, his tools laid out like a butcher's razors for shaving and veins, forceps for teeth and arrowheads, and the dreaded amputation knife, its edge kept viciously keen. What made them truly revolutionary wasn't their skill, though some possessed astonishing dexterity, but their accessibility. While university-trained physicians debated humors in Latin, barber surgeons worked in the vernacular, their shops open to peasants and princes alike. Their guilds, established as early as the 1300s, became Europe's first system of surgical training. Apprentices learned by doing, starting with leech application and graduating to trepanning skulls or setting compound fractures. The best-kept detailed casebooks, noting which techniques saved lives and which ended in screams. One such ledger from 15th century London records a staggering detail. Barber surgeons who washed their tools in hot water between patients had lower infection rates, a crude grasp of antisepsis centuries before Lister. Yet history remembers them as butchers rather than pioneers. Why? The answer lies in the messy intersection of class and medicine. Elite physicians, eager to distance themselves from hands-on work, painted barber surgeons as uneducated hacks. Satirical woodcuts showed them drunkenly sawing off the wrong leg or yanking teeth with comically oversized pliers. The truth was far more nuanced. When the Black Death emptied university halls, it was barber surgeons who stepped into the breach, draining buboes and burning plague garments. On battlefields from Agincourt to Granada, their speed with a cautery iron saved countless soldiers from bleeding out. Their legacy hides in plain sight. That red and white barber pole, originally symbolizing blood and bandages, the title Mr. for surgeons in Britain, a holdover from when they were distinct from doctor physicians. Even our modern divide between surgeons and general practitioners echoes their guild structure. Perhaps their greatest contribution was democratizing medicine, proving that healing didn't require a doctorate, just steady hands, empirical observation, and the courage to work where the blood flows. Next time you pass a barber shop, remember, those scissors once did more than trim hair, they stitched the ragged edges of history itself. Beneath the flickering torchlight of a dozen European villages, women whispered Trota's recipes like forbidden hymns rose, hip syrup to strengthen pregnant mothers, fennel seeds steeped in wine to ease labor pains, the precise angle to turn a breech baby before birth became tragedy. These weren't just remedies, they were acts of quiet rebellion. While universities barred women from medical study and churchmen condemned female healers as daughters of Eve, Trota's disciples, midwives, herbalists, the wise women of the hedgerows kept her wisdom alive through an underground network more resilient than any medieval guild. Their textbooks were memory and touch, passed from mother to daughter in moonlit kitchens, scribbled in cipher at the edges of prayer books, even stitched into embroidery patterns where a looping vine might secretly chart the womb's anatomy. The cost of this knowledge, constant peril. A midwife who successfully delivered a noble's heir one day might face the stake the next if the child later fell ill. Church records from 14th century France chillingly note the arrest of one Marthe of Provence, accused of witchcraft because her patients, unlike those treated by male physicians, survived childbirth at twice the average rate. Her crime, using a suspiciously clean linen cloth and knowing too much about the female body, yet persecution only deepened the midwife's ingenuity. In York, archaeologists recently uncovered a hollow walking stick filled with crushed ergot, a fungus Trota prescribed to speed stalled labor, hidden inside what appeared to be a simple cane. Venetian court documents describe how midwives disguised themselves as pilgrims, carrying birthing stools that folded into harmless-looking stools. What truly sustained them, though, wasn't secrecy alone, it was results. When plague ravaged a monastery and the surviving monks turned to a local midwife for help, her garlic poultices and vinegar washes saved more lives than their prayers. Nobles who publicly scorned old wives' tales privately summoned these women to their chambers, desperate for the fertility treatments universities couldn't provide. Even the church relied on them. Bishops' account books show payments to unnamed, wise women for treating clerical ailments too embarrassing for male doctors. The ultimate irony, while Trota's name was erased from official medical texts, her legacy lived on in the very accusations meant to destroy it. When inquisitors tortured midwives for their supernatural knowledge, their transcripts inadvertently preserved Trota's techniques. Interrogation records from Germany detail exactly how a healer named Agatha used warm oil and gentle pressure to reposition a transverse baby, a method still taught in modern obstetrics. These women didn't just endure, they transformed persecution into preservation, ensuring that when science finally caught up with their wisdom, the proof had been there all along, hidden in plain sight between the lines of their own persecution records. Their greatest triumph wasn't surviving the flames, but lighting a torch that would guide medicine out of the dark. In the hallowed lecture halls of Montpellier University, where 14th-century scholars debated Aristotle and Galen with near-religious fervor, Bernard de Gordon stood apart, not just for his medical brilliance, but for the radical idea that healing required more than textbooks. While his peers lectured on humors and star charts, this Scottish-born professor insisted students sit by patients' bedsides, observing not just symptoms but the fear in their eyes, the tremble in their hands. His Lilium Medicinae wasn't just a medical compendium. It was the first textbook to dedicate entire chapters to the art of listening, the importance of gentle touch, even the warning signs of physician burnout. Picture the scene, gowned scholars scribbling notes as Bernard demonstrated how to steady a shaking cup for an elderly patient, or how a well-timed joke could ease a child's terror before bloodletting. His most revolutionary lesson, that melancholy, what we now call depression, wasn't demonic possession but an illness treatable with sunlight, music, and human connection. He prescribed social visits for the isolated, light exercise for the lethargic, even wrote detailed instructions for caregivers to avoid harsh tones with the mentally ill. This flew in the face of medieval norms where the mad were often chained in darkness. Yet Bernard's methods worked. Records from Montpellier's infirmary show his depressive patients recovered at twice the rate of those treated with standard purges and isolation. So why did history forget the man who pioneered holistic care? The answer lies in medicine's painful march toward professionalization. As universities sought to distinguish themselves from folk healers, they emphasized complex theories over bedside manner. Bernard's emphasis on empathy didn't fit the new model of the aloof, authoritative physician. By the Renaissance, his name had been scrubbed from syllabi, his humane approach dismissed as soft compared to the cutting-edge anatomy lectures of Vesalius. Even his groundbreaking work on mental health was rebranded. A 16th-century Parisian edition of Lilium Medicinae literally cut those chapters, deeming them irrelevant to proper medicine. The tragedy isn't just Bernard's erasure, it's how long it took medicine to rediscover his truths. Modern studies now confirm what he knew, that compassionate care improves outcomes, that depression responds to social interaction, that healers who listen catch diagnoses others miss. His ghost lingers in every med school's belated push for narrative medicine, every resident taught to ask not just where does it hurt, but what matters to you. Bernard's real lesson wasn't just about kindness, it was about the courage to value what can't be measured in a lab, even when the institution prefers cold certainty to messy humanity. The year 1492 should have been a triumph for medicine. In the bustling ports of Spain, Jewish physicians like Isaac Israeli, men who had synthesized Greek, Arab, and Hebrew medical knowledge into treatment centuries ahead of their time, packed their manuscripts alongside meager belongings. The Alhambra decree had given them an impossible choice: convert, flee, or die. As ships carried these exiled healers to Italy, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire, Christian scholars across Europe eagerly ransacked their abandoned libraries. The irony was bitter. The very rulers who'd driven out Jewish doctors would soon rely on plagiarized versions of their work, scrubbed clean of any mention of their origins. Take Isaac's Book of Fevers, a masterpiece tracing illnesses to specific organs rather than vague humors. Within a decade of his exile, Latin translations circulated through Paris and Bologna attributed to anonymous Hebrew scholars, or worse, rebranded as rediscovered Gaelic texts. A particularly brazen Venetian printer even inserted Isaac's groundbreaking fever classifications into a newly discovered manuscript by Hippocrates, complete with a forged Greek title. This erasure wasn't accidental, it was systematic. Universities dependent on church funding couldn't admit they were teaching heretical knowledge, so scribes meticulously replaced Hebrew terms with Latin, swapped out Jewish patient anecdotes for Christian ones, and in some cases burned the originals after copying. Yet traces of the truth lingered in the margins. A surviving copy of Moses Maimonides' medical aphorisms at the University of Padua bears angry scribbles from a 15th century student. Why must we learn from this Jew when Aristotle says otherwise? Nearby, a professor's note concedes, though his faith be damned, his medicine saves. Even the Vatican's own archives reveal contradictions. Ledgers show payments to Jewish doctors for secret consultations, while public decrees condemned their practices. One poignant letter from a bishop in Seville begs his exiled physician to send remedies, in your hand but named as mine. The persecution of these healers did more than steal credit, it fractured medical progress. When Isaac's pupil Joseph fled to Tunis, he took with him advanced techniques for cataract surgery that wouldn't reach Europe for another 100 years. Herbal compendiums describing saffron for depression or pomegranate for heart ailments vanished into private collections, only to be rediscovered by Renaissance botanists who'd never acknowledged their sources. The greatest loss wasn't the knowledge itself, but the collaborative spirit that had created it, the interfaith dialogues of Spanish hospitals where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian doctors once debated diagnoses over shared texts. Today, as historians painstakingly reconstruct these stolen legacies from palimpsests and smuggled letters, they uncover a haunting pattern. The most enduring ideas often outlive their creators, but rarely their identities. The next time you hear of a medieval breakthrough, ask who really held the scalpel and why history made sure you wouldn't know their name. The apothecary shops of 10th century Cordoba gleamed like jewels under the Andalusian sun, their polished brass scales catching the light, their ceramic jars labeled in meticulous Arabic script, each containing remedies from as far away as India and China. Here, in the bustling heart of Islamic Spain, pharmacists weren't just shopkeepers. They were scientists who standardized drug purity, documented side effects, and even maintained formal dispensaries attached to hospitals, a concept Europe wouldn't adopt for centuries. Their crowning achievement, the Kitab al-Saydola, a pharmaceutical encyclopedia so precise it listed over 3,000 substances, from the mundane honey for wounds to the exotic camphor for heart palpitations, each with exact dosage instructions based on a patient's age and weight. What made their knowledge irresistible and ultimately easy to steal was its undeniable effectiveness. While European physic relied on vague notions like a pinch of wolfsbane or prayers to Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Cordoban pharmacists measured ingredients to the grain, distilled alcohol for sterile tinctures, and used solubility tests to detect adulterated drugs. Their methods were systematic to the point of poetry: saffron threads counted by the dozen, rosewater distilled in copper alembics at precise temperatures. Even early quality control checks where a scribe would taste random batches of syrups to ensure consistency. When a Crusader knight carried home a tiny vial of their opium-based painkiller, its power to silence battlefield agony made it more coveted than any relic. Yet this very precision became the vector for their erasure. As Latin translators in Toledo and Salerno scrambled to copy Islamic texts, they faced a dilemma: how to reconcile superior, infidel science with Christian supremacy. The solution: strategic omission. A 13th century manuscript now in the Vatican Library shows the telltale scissors work whole chapters on pharmacy, lifted verbatim from Kitab al-Saydola, but attributed to an ancient Greek master. The original Arabic diagrams of distillation apparatus were redrawn with deliberate errors, making them appear primitive, while the meticulous dosage tables became general recommendations to fit Europe's less rigorous standards. Even their groundbreaking work on drug interactions, like warning against mixing henbane with alcohol, was rebranded as folk wisdom, once stripped of its algebraic calculations. The greatest theft, though, wasn't of recipes but of credibility. When European pharmacies finally adopted glass display jars and written prescriptions in the 1400s, chroniclers portrayed these innovations as spontaneous rediscoveries of Roman tradition. Never mind that Roman apothecaries had been little more than spice merchants. The myth of classical revival allowed Europe to absorb Islamic advances while denying their origin. A bitter clue survives in a marginal note by a scribe copying a Cordoban formulary. Though their faith be darkness, their measurements shine. Today, as pharmacists still measure in grains, a unit standardized by those Andalusian scales or compound syrups using techniques perfected in medieval Cordoba, the ghosts of those unsung scientists linger. Their real legacy isn't just in the drugs we take, but in the very idea that healing should be grounded in rigor rather than superstition, a truth so universal it transcends the borders that tried to contain it. Deep in the forests and hedgerows of medieval Europe, far from the marble halls of universities, hands roughened by soil and seasons moved with quiet precision, plucking blossoms at dawn, digging roots under a waning moon, whispering songs to plants as they worked. These were the women herbalists, the unlettered pharmacists of the countryside whose knowledge of bark and leaf outstripped any leather-bound tome. A mother diagnosing jaundice by the yellow tinge of a child's fingernails, then brewing dandelion tea to cleanse the liver. A grandmother stitching wounds with spiderwebs soaked in yarrow tincture, knowing the combination staunched bleeding better than any cautery iron. Theirs was a science of observation and oral tradition, passed knee to knee by firelight, each generation adding discoveries like beads on a string. What made their craft so threatening wasn't its strangeness, but its effectiveness. When a village herbalist's chamomile poultice eased a noblewoman's migraine where a licensed physician's bloodletting had failed, it exposed the fragility of institutional medicine. Records from a 1343 Inquisition trial in southern France chillingly describe a peasant woman named Alay who cured falling sickness with a tea of skullcap and valerian. The clerics didn't dispute her results, they condemned her for achieving them without Latin prayers or university approval. Her defense, that she'd learned the remedy from her mother who learned it from hers, only sealed her fate. The real crime wasn't witchcraft, it was competence outside the sanctioned hierarchy. The demonization followed a grimly predictable script. Plants with psychoactive properties, like belladonna for pain or ergot for labor, became devil's herbs. Moon phase harvesting turned into occult rituals. Even the simple act of writing down recipes in the vernacular rather than Latin was cited as evidence of heresy in multiple trials. A particularly heartbreaking account from Germany describes a midwife burning at the stake with her apron pockets full of annotated plant sketches, the only book she'd ever owned. Yet the very documents meant to erase these women inadvertently preserved their wisdom. Inquisitors' transcripts detail exact recipes, how much feverfew to steep for headaches, which riverbank mosses best prevented infection. The tragic irony, just decades after these persecutions peaked, university-trained physicians began quietly incorporating those same remedies into their practice, now rebranded as scholarly discoveries. The 1517 Guard der Gesundheit, one of Europe's first printed herbals, cribbed entire sections from oral traditions while dismissing their origins as old wives' tales. Monastic gardens once tended by condemned herb wives suddenly boasted new medicinal cultivars. Even the iconic image of the witch's flying ointment, a blend of hallucinogenic plants, resurfaced in elite medical circles as surgical anesthetics, stripped of its folkloric associations. What survived the flames wasn't just knowledge, but a way of seeing. These women understood what modern science now confirms: that willow bark contains nature's aspirin, that honey fights infection better than medieval purges, that healing often lies in the subtle interplay of compounds rather than singular miracle cures. Their legacy lingers in every backyard gardener who grows echinacea for colds, in every pharmacist who compounds plant-derived drugs, in every researcher studying ethnobotany with newfound respect. They remind us that wisdom needs no parchment to endure sometimes. It takes root in the humblest soil, waiting centuries for the world to recognize its worth. Amidst the flickering candlelight of 1,000 sleepless nights, fingers stiff from cold and ink stained from labor moved with quiet devotion across endless parchment. These were the monastic scribes, history's unsung librarians who bent over medical texts in drafty scriptoriums, copying not just words but the fragile thread of knowledge itself. Picture a Benedictine monk in the 9th century, his breath visible in the icy air as he meticulously reproduces Galen's anatomical diagrams, or a Cistercian brother in the 1200s tracing Arabic pharmacopoeias brought back from Crusader raids. Their names are lost, their graves unmarked, yet every stroke of their pens was an act of defiance against the chaos of war, plague, and time. What made their work so vital? In an age when a single library fire could erase centuries of learning, these scribes became living repositories. When Vikings sacked monasteries, when Mongols burned cities, when the Black Death emptied entire towns, the scribes kept copying. Their manuscripts weren't mere duplicates, they were often the only surviving witnesses to breakthroughs. A 12th century copy of Dioscorides de Materia Medica, for instance, preserved ancient Greek descriptions of opium's pain-relieving properties that would later inspire medieval anesthetics. Without these anonymous hands, Avicenna's canon might have vanished when Baghdad's libraries fell, and Hildegard of Bingen's herbal wisdom could have been reduced to hearsay. Yet their anonymity was no accident. Monastic rules demanded humility, forbidding scribes from signing their work. Some left subtle clues, a doodled cat in the margin, a prayer for warmer ink hidden in the colophon, but most vanished into the parchment itself. The irony is crushing. The very texts that saved lives rarely credited the hands that saved the texts. Even when a scribe's identity survived, history often erased it. Take Brother Adelard of Rheims, who copied over 60 medical manuscripts in the 1100s. His obituary praised his devotion to scripture, without mentioning that his copies of Arabic surgical manuals would train generations of European physicians. The scribe's greatest challenge wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. Translating Greek and Arabic terms into Latin required more than literacy. It demanded medical understanding. A single mistranscribed measurement could turn a life-saving dose into poison. Marginal notes reveal their struggles. Is this drachm as in weight or coin? Or the Arabic word for pulse here seems different. Some scribes even cross-referenced multiple versions of the same text, creating early forms of peer review. Their fidelity to accuracy laid the groundwork for modern pharmacology. When a 14th century scribe in Padua corrected a corrupted recipe for digitalis tea, he unknowingly prevented countless fatal overdoses. Why does their silence resonate today? Because they remind us that knowledge isn't just discovered, it's preserved, often by those who ask for no glory. While kings and surgeons dominate medical histories, the scribe's legacy lives on in every digitized manuscript, every backup server, every effort to safeguard wisdom against the erosions of time. Their quiet hands held the lantern in medicine's darkest night, ensuring that when dawn finally broke over the Renaissance, there were still pages left to read. The battlefield tent smelled of blood and crushed herbs, its linen walls trembling in the desert wind as a woman in a bloodied veil bent over a groaning Frankish knight. His surcoat bore the cross of the Crusades, the very symbol that had burned her village months before, yet her hands moved without hesitation, packing his arrow wound with honey-soaked linen while murmuring soothing words in Arabic. This was the untold reality of the Crusades, Muslim women nursing their sworn enemies back to health, their compassion outshining the era's relentless brutality. Records from the siege of Antioch reveal the staggering scope of their mercy. When Crusader forces, starving and diseased, collapsed outside the city walls, it was local Arab women who brought them bread and vinegar-soaked cloths for their fevers. Saladin's own field hospitals, manned largely by female attendants, treated Christian and Muslim wounded alike, with protocols so advanced they separated patients by injury type to prevent cross-contamination. A Frankish chronicler, grudgingly impressed, wrote of Saracen women who handle men's wounds as gently as their own children. Why did history bury their heroism? The answer lies in the propaganda machines of both sides. Crusader lords couldn't admit their survival often depended on heathen women, so chroniclers recast them as silent specters or, worse, temptresses administering witchcraft. Arab poets, eager to glorify male warriors, minimized nursing as mere women's work. The truth survived only in fragments. A Hospitaller knight's diary praising an unnamed nurse's skill with burn ointments, a Genos merchant's letter home marveling at Muslim midwives saving Christian mothers during siege-induced labors. The cruelest irony, many of these women were healing the very men who'd killed their families. Accounts from Acre describe a widow recognizing her husband's murderer among the wounded, yet still changing his bandages daily because, as she reportedly said, Allah judges the sword, but the hand that tends must know no hatred. Their legacy whispers in every modern war hospital where healers pledge to treat friend and foe alike, proving that even in history's darkest chapters, humanity flickers brightest in the hands we've been taught to forget. In the choking fog of a plague-stricken 1400s Florence, a physician named Tommaso del Garbo did the unthinkable. He counted. While others fled or prayed, this survivor of the Black Death moved through the corpse-choked streets with ink-stained fingers, recording daily death tolls, noting which households succumbed fastest, even sketching diagrams of how illness spread through families. His leather-bound ledger, now crumbling in a Venetian archive, contains chillingly accurate observations that those who isolated early survived more often, that fumigating homes with vinegar seemed to slow transmission, that the disease moved along trade routes like a shadow following merchants. These weren't guesses, they were the first empirical evidence of contagion theory, gathered at unimaginable personal cost. Half of Tommaso's own family lay buried beneath his notes. Why did Europe ignore such obvious truths for 4 centuries? The answer lies in the collision of faith, fear, and institutional inertia. Church authorities rejected the idea of invisible transmission as heretical. If disease spread through mere proximity, where was God's judgment in sparing the wicked or striking down the pious? Medical faculties, wedded to Galen's miasma theory of bad air, dismissed survivor accounts as panic-stricken folklore. A particularly vicious cycle emerged. Plague doctors who advocated quarantine measures were accused of causing the very hysteria that worsened outbreaks. When the Milanese physician Guido da Vigevano suggested burning the belongings of the dead in 1348, he was nearly stoned by a mob convinced this would anger their ghosts. The suppression wasn't just ideological, it was economic. Italian city-states dependent on trade couldn't afford the financial paralysis of prolonged quarantines. Venetian merchants lobbied aggressively against port closures, funding scientific treatises that blamed the plague on earthquakes or planetary alignments. In London, the Crown confiscated the journals of a physician named John of Burgundy after he demonstrated that neighborhoods with strict curfews had lower mortality rates. His findings threatened the lucrative practice of selling plague exemptions to nobles. Even when survivor doctors like the remarkable Arab physician Ibn al-Khatib wrote exhaustive treatises proving person-to-person transmission through case studies, their works were literally locked away. A marginal note in a 15th century Vatican manuscript chillingly justifies this, lest such knowledge incite the people to despair of divine mercy. The bitter irony, these silenced observations contained the very strategies that would later tame epidemics. Tommaso's notes on vinegar disinfection anticipated antiseptics by 500 years. Arab doctors' insistence on changing cloth masks hourly foreshadowed modern PPE protocols. When the Great Plague of London finally forced authorities to implement corpse collection teams and household quarantines in 1665, they were unknowingly following 14th century Florentine playbooks, just 3 centuries too late for 30 million lives. What makes their legacy so haunting isn't just the wasted knowledge, it's the courage required to document truth while death circled. These physician survivors wrote knowing their words might die with them, yet still they measured, compared, and testified. In an age when most saw the plague as God's inscrutable will, they dared to suggest patterns, and in doing so, planted the seeds of epidemiology itself. Their ghosts whisper a warning we've yet to fully heed, that the greatest barrier to surviving catastrophe isn't ignorance, but our refusal to learn from those who have already paid the price. Behind the iron gates of medieval asylums are places we imagine as little more than human warehouses. A quiet revolution in mental health care was unfolding. While popular histories paint these institutions as dens of chains and neglect, fragments of patient records tell a different story, of anonymous caregivers who soothed manic episodes with lullabies, who calmed panic attacks by simply sitting and listening, who prescribed sunlight and conversation long before modern therapy existed. In St. Mary of Bethlehem Hospital, infamously nicknamed Bedlam, accounts survive of keepers leading patients in daily gardening, noting how the rhythm of planting seeds eased depressive spirals. At the Gilles Sanctuary in Belgium, townsfolk took the mentally ill into their homes, treating them not as possessed or dangerous, but as neighbors deserving dignity. These weren't just acts of kindness, they were deliberate therapeutic interventions, documented in marginalia that later scholars dismissed as superstitious or unscientific. What made their empathy seem naive? The answer lies in medicine's painful journey toward professionalization. As universities began systematizing knowledge in the late Middle Ages, anything that couldn't be measured, like the healing power of a caregiver's tone, was relegated to folklore. A 15th century manuscript from Padua captures this shift perfectly. A physician's sneering note beside a description of music therapy reads, "Better to purge the melancholic humors than coddle them with harp strings." The emerging medical elite favored dramatic interventions, bleeding to rebalance humors, spinning chairs to reset the brain, ice baths to shock patients into rationality. Compared to these theatrical cures, the asylum keepers' gentle methods appeared primitive, especially since most were women, peasants, or monks without formal degrees. Yet their legacy persists in ways modern psychiatry is only beginning to acknowledge. Recent studies confirm what these medieval healers observed, that structured routines reduce anxiety, that communal singing releases oxytocin, that touching soil literally alters depression-linked bacteria in the gut. The Geel model, now considered groundbreaking in psychiatric rehabilitation, was perfected in the 1300s. Even Freud's talking cure echoes the confessional practices of Benedictine monks who documented how unburdening traumatic memories eased night terrors. The real tragedy isn't that their methods were forgotten, it's that they were actively suppressed. When Renaissance anatomists began dissecting brains, they declared mental illness purely physical, dismissing centuries of observed psychological nuance. A haunting entry in a 16th century asylum logbook captures this arrogance. "Ceased the music and walks today, began mercury treatments instead. For every step forward, medicine took 2 steps back until we circled right back to where we began, discovering that compassion might just be the most potent treatment of all." These unnamed healers whisper across the centuries a simple truth we're still relearning. Sometimes the most advanced therapy is human connection, dressed in the humble robes of the past. Beneath the flickering torchlight of Padua's clandestine anatomy theaters, where the scent of vinegar and decay clung to the air, a group of scholars bent over forbidden cadavers with steady hands and racing hearts. Long before Vesalius scandalized Europe with his groundbreaking De Humani Corporis Fabrica, these unnamed pioneers were already peeling back the skin of history, mapping muscles and veins under the constant threat of the Church's wrath. Their crime wasn't just dissection, it was daring to prove Galen wrong. The Greek physician's ancient texts, revered as infallible for over 1,000 years, described a human body that didn't exist: a 5-lobed liver, a hollow heart, a uterus shaped like a ram's horn. But the Paduan anatomist's clandestine sketches told a different story, one stroke of charcoal at a time. Why risk excommunication or worse, because the truth demanded witnesses? One surviving fragment from a 15th century notebook, hidden between the pages of a prayer book, captures their defiance. "Saw today the heart's true chambers 4, not 3 as the ancients claimed." Galen never cut open a man, only apes. These weren't just corrections, they were acts of rebellion against an entire intellectual dynasty. The anatomists worked in shifts, some dissecting while others stood watch for church officials, their discoveries passed along in coded language. A red thread might mean an arterial network, while moon-shaped curves referred to the cerebellum. Their greatest innovation, layered drawings that peeled back the body like an onion, skin first, then muscle, then bone, a technique Da Vinci would later perfect in his notebooks. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Church doctrine held that the body's sanctity was paramount, even in death. Dissection violated the promise of resurrection. Authorities turned a blind eye only for executed criminals, and even then, the body had to be reassembled for burial. Padua's scholars circumvented these rules with macabre ingenuity. Gravediggers smuggled fresh corpses through underground tunnels, their payment left in wine or silver under cover of darkness. One account describes a professor hiding inside a coffin himself to evade night patrols, his pockets stuffed with hastily sketched observations. Yet their greatest danger came from within. Medical faculties, whose careers depended on teaching Galen's errors, actively suppressed the new findings. A chilling letter from 1483 warns an overeager student, "Speak not of the kidney's true shape in lecture, lest they burn you for heresy alongside your diagrams." Some anatomists resorted to publishing their work anonymously, attributing discoveries to certain Arab masters or burying them in agricultural texts. A particularly cunning professor hid groundbreaking observations about lung tissue in a treatise on livestock breeding, knowing censors would skim past it. The legacy of these shadow scholars pulses through modern medicine. When Vesalius finally published his revolutionary atlas in 1543, half his original illustrations bore uncanny resemblance to Paduan sketches likely smuggled to him by students who'd trained there. Even the iconic anatomical man pose, arms outstretched as if crucified, traces back to their secret studies. But perhaps their most enduring lesson is this: progress often wears a disguise, advancing not in the blaze of revelation, but in the cautious hands of those who dare to see what power declares invisible. Their ghosts linger in every medical school cadaver lab, where students still learn that truth, like the human body, reveals itself layer by layer, but only to those willing to cut deep enough. In the dim backrooms of 14th century apothecary shops, where the air hung thick with the earthy scent of crushed herbs and the metallic tang of powdered minerals, a quiet revolution was unfolding. These weren't just merchants peddling dubious cure-alls, they were Europe's first pharmaceutical scientists, weighing ingredients on brass scales accurate to the grain, recording patient reactions to new tinctures, and maintaining ledgers that read like early clinical trials. The Guild Apothecaries workspace was a masterpiece of organization. Dried foxglove blossoms stored in glass jars labeled with their harvest year, opium poppy extracts locked in iron chests, and meticulously copied recipe books bound in pigskin to withstand daily use. Their most radical innovation, standardization. For the first time, a fever-reducing potion in Paris contained the same dose of willow bark as its counterpart in Prague because guild rules demanded it. This precision didn't emerge from thin air. After the Black Death wiped out swaths of untrained herb peddlers, surviving apothecaries realized haphazard measurements could mean the difference between remedy and poison. Guilds instituted brutal quality controls. Apprentices caught adulterating saffron with marigold petals faced public floggings, while masters who sold spoiled medicines had their shops shuttered. Venetian records describe tasting committees, where senior apothecaries blind tested random batches of syrups, rejecting any that deviated from the standard viscosity or flavor. London's Guild even employed secret shoppers, disguised officials who purchased remedies incognito, then compared them against reference samples kept in vaults beneath City Hall. Yet their crowning achievement was the dispensatorium, a collaboratively written formulary that read like a medieval FDA guideline. The Nuremberg Codex of 1498, for instance, specified exactly how many drops of lavender oil to steep per ounce of alcohol, how to test for counterfeit mercury, even how to identify substandard cinnamon by its lack of tongue-tingling warmth. These weren't suggestions, they were enforceable law. Apothecaries who violated them risked losing their coveted guild seals, the equivalent of a modern pharmaceutical license. So why don't we know their names? The erosion began with industrialization. As 19th century factories mass-produced pills and potions, corporations systematically bought up ancient apothecary formulas, stripping them of their origins. A German firm's cough syrup might owe its recipe to a 15th century guild master's handwritten notes, but advertisements credited only the company's modern laboratories. Worse, the rise of medical schools created a hierarchy that dismissed apothecaries as mere druggists, despite their centuries of pharmacological expertise. A bitter irony, many early pharmaceutical CEOs were guild dropouts who'd failed their purity exams, only to profit by automating the very standards they'd once struggled to meet. The final insult came from history books, romanticized narratives of lone geniuses like Pasteur and Fleming overshadowed 8 centuries of collective apothecary wisdom. When penicillin was discovered, few noted that medieval guilds had already documented mold's antibacterial properties. They just lacked the tools to isolate the active compound. Today, as pharmacists rediscover the value of compounded medicines and personalized dosages, they're unknowingly reviving guild principles. The next time you read a pill bottle's exact milligram measurements, remember, that precision wasn't born in a corporate lab, but in the shadowed workshops of men and women who weighed each dose as if lives depended on it because they did. The sack of Constantinople in 1453 wasn't just the fall of a city, it was a hemorrhage of knowledge. As Ottoman soldiers stormed the Theodosian walls, a handful of Byzantine physicians did something desperate and extraordinary. They stuffed their robes with manuscripts instead of gold, abandoning homes and livelihoods to salvage the medical wisdom of 1,000 years. Picture these scholars, men like Johannes Argyropoulos and Demetrios Angelos fleeing through smoke-choked streets, their arms cradling precious codices of Hippocrates and Galen, their minds racing with the realization that they alone now carried the torch of Greek medicine into exile. What made their flight so pivotal? Constantinople had been the last living library of antiquity, where unbroken chains of scribes had preserved texts the West thought lost forever. While Europe's medical schools struggled with garbled Arabic translations of Greek classics, Byzantine doctors still read them in their original language, complete with centuries of marginal notes refining diagnoses and treatments. Angelos, for instance, carried a unique copy of Dioscorides de Materia Medica annotated with Byzantine observations like using crushed pomegranate rind to stop bleeding, a technique later adopted by Renaissance surgeons. The tragedy, history remembers maimed the conqueror, but not the refugees who outmaneuvered his armies to smuggle knowledge westward. These doctors didn't just transport books, they were walking universities. In the squalid refugee camps of Italy, they treated fellow exiles with methods forgotten in the West, sterilizing wounds with vinegar, diagnosing heart conditions by pulse variations, even performing cataract surgeries with hollow needles. Venetian merchants, initially hostile to the influx of Greek beggars, soon noticed their skills. A ledger from the Doge archives records a payment to an unnamed physic from Constantinople for saving a nobleman's son with a fever remedy involving willow bark and cool compresses, an early glimpse of aspirin and hydrotherapy. Yet their greatest gift was mentorship. In Padua and Bologna, Byzantine immigrants became the secret tutors of Renaissance medicine. A young Thomas Linacre, future founder of London's Royal College of Physicians, learned Greek from Argyropoulos not to read poetry, but to decipher Galen's original texts without medieval distortions. The Byzantine method of clinical observation, honed through generations of bedside teaching, quietly replaced Europe's reliance on theoretical humoral dogma. When Leonardo da Vinci sought accurate anatomical references for his sketches, it was a Greek refugee physician who lent him a smuggled copy of an Alexandrian dissection manual. The cruelest irony, just as their knowledge ignited the Renaissance, the refugees themselves faded into obscurity. Italian humanists, eager to claim classical heritage as their own, downplayed Byzantine contributions. Printed editions of Galen scrubbed the marginal notes that contained centuries of Greek clinical experience. Even the famed Fabrica of Vesalius, often hailed as the birth of modern anatomy, borrowed heavily from Byzantine diagrams without credit. Only recently have scholars pieced together their legacy from cryptic references. A Venetian guild's complaint about Greek interlopers stealing patients, a Florentine diary praising an immigrant doctor's skill with the ancient method of cupping. These physicians, nameless in most histories, embodied medicine's most painful truth, that progress often depends not on the celebrated pioneers, but on the forgotten hands that keep the flame alive through darkness. Their ghosts linger in every Renaissance textbook, every Latin transcription of a Greek term, every modern hospital where healers still wrestle with the same eternal choice: save the wealth or save the wisdom. They chose wisely. Beneath the weight of every celebrated name in medical history lies an unmarked grave, the resting place of countless healers whose hands steadied the trembling, whose remedies cooled the fevered, whose courage defied plagues and prejudice, only to vanish without so much as a whisper in the archive. For every Trota who left a manuscript, there were 100 midwives burned as witches. For every Al-Bucossis whose tools were copied, 1,000 apothecaries died with their formulas unrecorded. Their legacy isn't just in the remedies we've inherited, but in the very shape of our humanity, the stubborn belief that no life is disposable, that pain demands witness, that healing is a covenant between strangers. Consider the nameless faces in the margins of history. The enslaved woman in Moorish Spain who taught her enslaver how to suture wounds with silk thread, her technique immortalized in his textbooks while her identity dissolved into the ink. The Jewish doctor in 14th century Pravas who compiled a plague treatise in Hebrew, only for it to surface decades later attributed to a Christian monk. The countless village grandmothers who recognized that willow bark eased headaches long before chemists isolated salicylic acid, their wisdom dismissed as old wives' tales until science caught up. These weren't just footnotes, they were the living heart of medicine beating in the shadows. How do we honor those without graves? Start by questioning why they were erased. When a 12th century French medical text advises, take 3 strands of a hanged man's rope for quartan fever, whose hands first tied that noose into medicine? When Renaissance paintings show surgeons operating in spotless white aprons, who were the laundresses boiling those linens to prevent infection? History loves its lone geniuses, but healing was always a chorus. The herbalist foraging pre-dawn, the scribe correcting dosage errors by candlelight, the wet nurse whose milk nourished both infant and immune system. Perhaps the most fitting memorial isn't in stone, but in practice. Every time a modern nurse washes her hands without thinking, she mirrors the unnamed sisters of medieval infirmaries. When a pharmacist measures milligrams with precision, he inherits the guild apothecaries' obsessive scales. Even our clinical language carries their ghosts. The word quarantine, born from Venetian dockworkers' pidgin Arabic, the term Caesarean, likely borrowed from Roman midwives' slang. To practice medicine today is to walk a path paved by the forgotten. So light no candles, carve no plaques. Instead, listen beneath the hum of every hospital corridor, in the rustle of sterile gauze, in the quiet before the scalpel pierces skin. That's where their voices linger. The greatest tribute we can offer isn't remembrance, but continuation. To heal as they did, not for glory, but because it's what humans do when faced with suffering. In the end, their anonymity was never failure. It was the ultimate act of faith, the belief that knowledge belonged not to individuals, but to life itself. And life, like history, has a way of remembering what parchment cannot. Courage in medicine rarely wears a crown. It's more often found in the ink-stained hands of a heretic scribe, the steady grip of a midwife facing the stake, or the quiet resolve of a plague doctor who counts the dead when others dare not look. These 30 unsung heroes shared no royal titles or marble statues, but they possessed something far more enduring: the stubborn belief that healing was worth the risk, even when the world called it treason. Take the case of Jacoba Felice, dragged into court for the crime of saving lives without a license, or Guy de Chauliac, who dissected corpses under cover of darkness while the church condemned him. Their defiance wasn't reckless, it was calculated. Every time they chose to treat a patient, to record an observation, to pass on forbidden knowledge, they weighed the cost and acted anyway. What made their sacrifices different from mere stubbornness? They understood that progress doesn't trickle down from thrones, it bubbles up from the edges, from the places where necessity forces innovation. The barber surgeons with their blood-crusted aprons knew more about battlefield wounds than any university physician, precisely because they worked where the screams were loudest. The convent sisters who boiled bandages and sang psalms to the dying developed early infection control not from theory, but because they couldn't bear to watch another novice die of fever. Oppression became their unlikely ally. It forced creativity. When the church banned human dissection, anatomists like Mondino de Luzzi turned to pigs, whose organs closely resembled humans, and made breakthroughs in spite of the restrictions. Yet history's bias toward the elite runs deep. We remember Hippocrates' name, but not the Egyptian healers who taught him, Vesalius's sketches, but not the Byzantine refugees who preserved the manuscripts that made them possible. This erasure wasn't accidental. It served systems that feared the democratization of knowledge. When a peasant herbalist's remedy worked better than a bishop's prayer, it threatened the entire social order. That's why Trota's writings were rebranded under a male pseudonym, why Arab surgical tools were later claimed as Roman inventions, why the Black Death's most astute observers were silenced lest they reveal that the wealthy died as quickly as the poor. But legacy has a way of outliving censorship. Every time a modern nurse washes her hands, she channels Henry de Mondeville's vinegar-soaked bandages. When a pharmacist measures a milligram of medication, she inherits the precision of Cordoba's Apothecaries. Even our language betrays the truth. Words like quarantine and alcohol whisper their Arabic origins, stubborn remnants of the knowledge persecution couldn't erase. These healers didn't just advance medicine, they redefined what it means to be human, proving that compassion could be as revolutionary as any scalpel. Their stories ask us an uncomfortable question: who are today's marginalized healers? The community midwives in remote villages, the street medics treating protesters, the researchers battling diseases overlooked by pharmaceutical giants. They walk the same perilous path as their medieval forebears. Progress still begins where the powerful aren't looking. The real tribute to these 30 isn't just remembrance, but recognition that their fight never ended, it just changed disguises. When we listen to voices the system dismisses, when we value results over credentials, we don't just honor history, we become part of its unbroken, defiant thread. As the echoes of these 30 stories fade into history's corridors, one truth lingers like the scent of antiseptic in a clean room. Medicine was never built by marble statues, but by hands stained with herbs, ink, and sometimes blood. The real revolution didn't happen in lecture halls or royal court. It unfolded in plague-stricken alleyways, behind convent walls, and on battlefields where healers improvised tools from farm implements. These were people who didn't just challenge the science of their time, they defied the very hierarchies that declared who was allowed to heal and how. Think of the midwife stitching a birth tear with silk thread while the church debated whether women had souls. the barber surgeon boiling his instruments in vinegar long before germ theory gave him permission. The monk smuggling Arabic manuscripts past customs agents, knowing a single page might save thousands. Their brilliance wasn't just in what they discovered, but in their refusal to let dogma drown out compassion. When history told them, "This is how it's always been done," they whispered back, "But what if we tried something better, the most extraordinary part?" Their legacy isn't locked in the past. Every time a nurse adjusts a pillow without being asked, they channel the nuns of medieval infirmaries who knew comfort was medicine. When a researcher questions an outdated protocol, they inherit the defiance of Jacoba Felice in that Paris courtroom. Even the simple act of washing hands, a ritual we perform without thought, carries the ghost of Henry de Monville, who insisted on clean bandages while his peers mocked him. These unsung heroes didn't just leave us tools and techniques. They gifted us a mindset that healing belongs to anyone willing to learn, to listen, to dare. So who among these 30 lingers in your thoughts? Perhaps it's Trota, fighting to preserve women's medical knowledge as the world tried to erase it. Or Al-Bucossis, whose surgical instruments still shape modern operating rooms. Maybe it's the nameless scribes who copied manuscripts by candlelight, knowing their fingers might be the only thing standing between wisdom and oblivion. Their stories aren't relics, they're compasses. In an era where medicine still grapples with inequity and inertia, their lives ask us, what are we overlooking today? Whose voices might hold the next breakthrough if we're brave enough to hear them carry their light forward? Share the tale of the healer who moved you most, not as history, but as fuel for the fight still ahead. Because the next chapter of medicine won't be written by textbooks or algorithms, but by the stubborn, compassionate, gloriously human belief that no one should suffer when knowledge exists to ease their pain. Press subscribe, and together we'll keep unearthing the stories that remind us progress has always been a chorus, even when only a few voices survive the silence.